The day was September 2nd, 1999, in Doswell, Virginia, when a disaster struck King's Dominion. 13-year-old Eamon McIntyre and his crew, Mike, Adam, and Brandon, had already conquered the Shockwave 4 times in a row and climbed into those metal cages for another go. It wasn't just a ride. It was a loud iron beast that didn't let you sit down and relax. It was less like a coaster and more like a 95-foot-tall boxing match that hammered your body at 50 miles an hour. Eamon was used to the rough and tumble nature of it. He'd spent the entire afternoon feeling the weight of the world pull at his chest during the loops. But as the ride operators started their final safety checks around 6:30 p.m., a cold, dreadful feeling took over and his heart sank. He wasn't just dizzy from riding too much. That feeling was that sharp primal warning your body gives you when it knows you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. To understand why a 13-year-old was so terrified that he would eventually risk his life to escape, you have to remember the shadow hanging over the park that year. Only 2 weeks earlier, King's Dominion had turned into a crime scene. A 20-year-old named Timothy Fan had been riding this exact coaster when he was thrown into the sky during a sharp turn. Sadly, he didn't survive. The park had to shut the ride down for a few days, but after a quick look at the bolts, the management shrugged their shoulders and blamed the guy for his own death because, according to them, the machine was fine. But you can't just erase a memory like that from the tracks with some lousy explanation. Every kid in line knew his name, and every mom watching from behind the fence was gripping her purse. Eamon knew he was standing on a machine that had just claimed his soul, and that thought turned a tiny mechanical doubt into a full-blown panic attack. Then came the ride worker. Just some guy, probably bored out of his mind and having sweet dreams about his break, checking harnesses for the 1,000th time that shift. He gave Eamon's shoulder bar a lazy tug. Usually, that clink sound the harness makes when it's secure feels like a promise. But this time, it felt like a lie. The harness was loose and shaky. Eamon looked at his buddies, his eyes wide, but the click of the automatic locks, the sound that's supposed to mean the world won't let you fall, sounded thin and hollow. When the train lurched forward and started that slow, agonizing crawl up the first big hill, Eamon realized his life was hanging by a thread that was about to snap. "It's not locked, it's not locked," he yelled. His voice was cracked and filled with panic, trying to scream over the mechanical roar of the heavy chains pulling him towards the sky. His friends, Mike and Adam, saw the genuine terror in his face and realized this wasn't some teenage prank. They started screaming too, waving their arms like crazy, trying to catch the workers' eyes as they got smaller and smaller to people on the ground below. A woman walking past the entrance heard their frantic high-pitched pleas from the tracks above and sprinted to the control booth. Someone signaled to stop the ride, but for a boy dangling 30 feet in the air, waiting wasn't an option. In Eamon's head, the train wasn't going to stop. It was going to hit the peak. Gravity would take the wheel and he'd end up the headline, just like Timothy. Logic ceases to exist when you're 30 feet up and the only thing between you and the pavement is a piece of metal that feels like it's given up on you. Eamon didn't think, he just moved. He was skinny, he was scared, and he was acting on pure raw survival instinct. He squeezed his frame under the waist guard, let go of the machine, and just fell. The fall was 30 feet of terrifying empty air, followed by a bone-shattering crash onto a narrow metal walkway. The adrenaline hitting his system was so volcanic that he didn't even notice his knee had twisted or that his skin was bloody and torn. He scrambled up and started shaking his way down the service stairs, nearly knocking over a shocked ride worker halfway down. Behind him, the machine finally groaned to a halt, leaving his 3 friends stranded in the sky, stuck in the very seats they were now dying to escape. What followed was a cold mix of corporate denial and pure human trauma. Mike, Adam, and Brandon sat in those frozen cars, hearts hammering against their ribs, watching their friend disappear into the core of the ride structure. They begged the workers to let them out. They were done. The fun had died the second they saw Eamon jump for his life. But the park's rules were as stubborn as the steel tracks. The workers, maybe worried about a park-wide panic or a total shutdown, refused to let the boys out. They kept repeating that the machine was safe, as if it were a mantra. They actually forced those terrified kids to stay strapped in as they restarted the ride to finish the circuit. It was a nightmare loop, forced through loops and turns that felt like a sick joke while they were still vibrating with fear for their friend. When the boys finally stepped off the platform, they weren't met by doctors or anybody who cared about their mental state. Instead, they were handed free passes, vouchers for another ride on the same machine that had just pushed their friend to jump. It was a move so tone-deaf and heartless it was almost hard to wrap your head around. The boys didn't want free passes. They wanted to go home and never look at a roller coaster ever again. Nobody asked for their side of the story. No one kept them for questioning. The park seemed to want them to just blend back into the crowd and let the whole thing blow over like a bad smell. It was only when the boys found their parents and retold the story with voices shaking with fear and tears that the adults realized the gravity of what had just happened. The paperwork that followed was cold enough to freeze your blood. The inspectors looked at the bolts, saw the green lights on the control panel, and told the world there was nothing to see. They called it restless thoughts. Think about that for a second. They looked at a kid who was so convinced he was going to die that he jumped 30 feet onto a metal path, and they told him that he was just imagining things. They basically blamed the dead guy from 2 weeks before for spooking him, as if fear was the only thing that had malfunctioned. It was pretty obvious that they were more interested in protecting the machine's reputation than the kid's reality. But Eamon's dad wasn't having any of it. He had to watch his boy limp around the house, haunted by a ghost the park refused to admit existed. He didn't care about their safety sensors or their pointless PR statements. He went to the cameras and gave a blunt human answer that cut through all the corporate noise. He said the only safety feature that actually worked that day was his son's gut instinct. To the McIntyres, the park was a living fantasy land where machines were flawless gods. They tried to act like a harness locked on a spreadsheet was the same thing as a human being actually being safe. Shockwave stayed open for another 16 years, a strong iron dinosaur that fewer and fewer people wanted to challenge. As the company that built it went under and the stand-up craze died out, King's Dominion finally tore it down in 2015. It was sold for scrap metal, replaced by a new ride called Delirium. But for people who remember 1999, the spot where Shockwave once existed is always going to be haunted by those two young men, one who didn't make it and one who had to jump to save himself. Eamon McIntyre's story is more than just a scary moment from the 1990s. It's a loud, screaming reminder of the shaky trust that we all still put into these parks today. His physical cuts eventually healed, but the story still sticks around as a warning to every park owner. A machine is only as safe as the person sitting in it feels. When the screams turn from fun to real terror, no amount of safety lights can fix the damage done to a person's soul and psyche. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is realize that the ride is broken before it's too late.